The alarm hit at 11:58 p.m. A fighter jet was going down over the Rockies, the pilot unconscious, the aircraft spinning in a death spiral that ground control couldn't stop. Inside Horizon Ridge Military Medical Center, doctors stood frozen around the emergency radio, shouting questions nobody could answer. Trauma protocols meant nothing. Nobody in that room had ever prepped for a high-altitude ejection casualty with a cracked pressure suit and internal decompression damage. Nobody except the woman standing in the back, still holding a clipboard, wearing faded scrubs, the one they'd spent 3 years ignoring. Her name was Lena Marlowe. They called her just a nurse. They had no idea what that meant. Before we go any further, if you want to find out what Lena does next, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a like and leave a comment with the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. Now let's get into it. The night started the way most nights started at Horizon Ridge, understaffed, overlit, and loud in ways that had nothing to do with actual emergencies. Lena had been on since 7 a.m. 17 hours in, her feet had stopped registering pain somewhere around hour 12, and now they just felt like objects attached to her legs that happened to move when she told them to. She was finishing an incident report at the East Wing nursing station when the overhead intercom crackled and the charged desk phone rang at the same moment, which never meant anything good. She heard the word ejection and set her pen down. The main trauma bay was already filling up when she got there. Not with patients, but with people. Residents crowding the doorway. 2 attending nurses from the floor above who had no reason to be there. Dr. Marcus Webb from orthopedics, which made even less sense. And at the center of it all, standing with his arms crossed in front of the emergency radio console, was Dr. Victor Hale. Hale was the kind of man who filled space. 6'2", broad in the shoulders, silver at his temples in a way that photographed well. He'd been chief surgeon at Horizon Ridge for 4 years, and had the posture of someone who'd never once been told he was wrong and believed that fact made him correct. He turned when the radio crackled again and held up a hand for silence, like a conductor about to raise a baton. Sierra 9, we have the pilot's last telemetry at 19,000 feet. Ejection confirmed. Chute deployment is uncertain. ETA to potential impact zone. We're looking at static. What's the bird? Someone asked from the doorway. F-22 variant, said Dr. Webb, reading off a tablet. Training rotation out of Peterson. Pilot is Captain Ryan Keller, 31, male, no prior medical flags. Lena heard the aircraft designation, and something shifted in her chest. Not alarm exactly, more like the feeling of a door opening in a room she'd kept locked. She moved closer to the console. Pressure suit deployment during an uncontrolled ejection at that altitude, she said, not to anyone in particular, just saying it out loud the way you say something when you're thinking through it. If the chute didn't fully open, he hits at terminal velocity partial deceleration. Suit integrity matters more than anything else. If it cracked on exit, he's already got decompression onset, could be presenting with barotrauma to the sinuses, middle ear rupture, possible pulmonary. Nobody asked for your opinion. She didn't need to look up to know whose voice that was. Dr. Hale was watching her with the expression he reserved for interruptions. Not angry, exactly, just dismissive in the specific way that communicates you are wasting time that belongs to me. Nurse Marlowe, he said, I believe your assignment tonight is the East Wing. I heard the call. I have relevant. You have an incident report to finish. He turned back to the console. Stay in your lane. The residents nearest the door looked at their shoes. One of the nurses from upstairs caught Lena's eye and immediately looked away. Lena stood there for 2 seconds. Then she walked back to the East Wing. She didn't do it because she agreed with him. She did it because she knew, from experience, from years and years of learning what battles cost, that there are moments when pushing is the right call, and moments when pushing only burns time you don't have. She needed information before she could be useful, and right now the best way to get it was to stay close and wait. She picked up the incident report. She didn't read it. She listened. The trauma bay radio traffic bled through the hallways for the next 14 minutes. She caught enough fragments to reconstruct what was happening. The pilot had ejected, chute had deployed but was partially tangled, and he'd hit a ridge on the north face of a spur off the Mosquito Range. Not a clean landing, not a death sentence landing, but somewhere in the brutal middle. Rescue teams were already mobilizing from Peterson Air Force Base, but the weather was moving in from the northwest, a late-season system that would close the windows on a helicopter extraction inside of 2 hours. She knew that terrain. She'd worked a rescue off the northern Mosquito Spur once, years ago, in a life she didn't talk about at work. At 12:23 a.m., her pager buzzed. Not the general page, her personal code, the one that hadn't activated in 3 years. She stared at the number on the screen for a moment. Then she put the incident report in her drawer, folded it closed, and walked, not ran, walked, back to the trauma bay. The atmosphere had changed. One had set up a secondary communications rig, a military-grade unit that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago, and there was a man in a flight suit standing next to it who hadn't been there either. He was talking to Hale with the clipped, directional energy of someone who'd run out of time for pleasantries approximately 6 years ago. Need someone with high-altitude trauma extraction experience, specifically ejection injury presentation in cracked suit scenarios. Your trauma team lead indicated you had a specialist on staff. Hale's jaw was tight. Our staff is fully capable of handling whatever comes in from the field. That's not what I asked. The man in the flight suit glanced at a tablet. I'm looking for someone matching a specific background. Female, trauma medic, prior Air Force. The name I have is... He stopped, looked up. He was looking directly at Lena. She watched him go still in the way that people go still when they recognize something they weren't expecting to find. Are you Marlowe? He said. Yes. First name Lena? She didn't hesitate. Yes. He exhaled. Not relief exactly, but the sound of a problem becoming slightly less catastrophic. Major Greer, Peterson Rescue Coordination. We've been trying to reach you through your registered contact channels. They're outdated. They are. We need your assessment on the casualty extraction, specifically the injury profile and stabilization protocol, before we attempt the mountain evac. Lena felt Hale's attention shift onto her like a physical thing. She kept her eyes on Greer. What's the suit status? Partial breach. Left shoulder seam. Pilot lost consciousness approximately 40 seconds after ejection, came back around during descent. Rescue team on site is reporting altered mental status. Right side hearing loss, possible nosebleed at high altitude, sinus barotrauma, possibly ear. What's his position right now? Greer moved to the map pinned to the secondary console. She stepped beside him. Behind them, she could hear Hale shift his weight, but say nothing. The pilot had come down on a snowfield at roughly 11,000 feet. The rescue team was 22 minutes out. The weather window was shrinking, and whoever had put the preliminary evac plan together hadn't accounted for the fact that a pilot with pressure suit breach and early-stage barotrauma could not be hauled vertically up a cliff face into a hovering aircraft without making everything significantly worse. The vertical extraction protocol has to change, she said. If his suit breached on the left shoulder, the decompression effect on ascent during hoist would risk... Nurse Marlowe. Hale's voice was controlled but had an edge now, the kind that usually preceded a statement about authority. This briefing is outside your scope. Victor. That was the first time she'd ever used his first name. She turned to look at him for exactly 1 second. The extraction protocol on file will hurt him. I'm not arguing about who's in charge. I'm telling you what the physics does. Something passed across his face. Not acceptance. But he didn't speak again. She turned back to the map. The rescue team at 11,000 feet was led by a sergeant named Okafor, who'd done 2 tours and communicated primarily in short declarative sentences, which Lena appreciated. She talked him through the repositioning of the casualty, the manual pressure support at the shoulder seam they needed to maintain throughout the horizontal carry, and the monitoring protocol for any change in consciousness level that would indicate the barotrauma was progressing towards something worse. The trauma bay had filled up completely by then. Someone had called Dr. Annika Rao, the hospital's head of emergency medicine, who arrived in a gray cardigan with her hair still partially undone and spent the first 5 minutes standing to the side listening before she spoke. What do we know about the decompression timeline? Dr. Rao asked. If the breach happened at ejection altitude, he's been managing a partial pressure differential for approximately... Lena checked the clock, did the math. 51 minutes. The AMS symptoms are consistent with that window. We're not yet in the danger zone for neurological involvement, but if the evac takes longer than projected, then we push ahead of the weather window, Rao said. Yes. Rao nodded once. She looked at Major Greer. Give us the updated ETA. It was, Lena noted, the first time in the 3 years she'd worked at Horizon Ridge that she'd seen anyone redirect a conversation around Dr. Hale rather than through him. He was still in the room. He had not moved. But the room had reorganized itself without him. Outside, the wind had picked up. Through the long windows at the end of the bay, she could see the sky beginning to texture, clouds pulling in from the west, the kind of layered, fast-moving system that meant the helicopter pilots were already doing the math on how long they had. Okafor's voice came back through the radio, rougher with static now. We've got him stabilized and packaged. He's conscious, asking for his call sign. Keep saying something about the instruments. Lena leaned toward the console. Tell him the instruments aren't his problem right now. Tell him to breathe slow, regular, and not to move his head. What's his affect? Confused but oriented. Knows his name, doesn't know what day it is. That's the barotrauma. Keep him calm. Is he in pain? Says his ear feels like someone drove a spike through it. Tell him that's normal, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. Don't let him hold his breath. She heard Okafor relay that and heard, faintly, through the radio. A voice that sounded young and very tired. Say something like, fantastic, great news. She almost smiled. They got him out just before the weather closed. 47 minutes from the time she'd taken over the communications, the helicopter touched down on the Horizon Ridge roof, and by the time she got up there with the trauma cart, Captain Ryan Keller was on the gurney, helmet removed, a pressure bandage on his left shoulder over the suit seam, and conscious enough to be argumentative about the oxygen mask. He was 31, but he looked about 19 with the color drained from his face and the confusion still running behind his eyes. The aircraft, he said when they were moving him through the rooftop doors. What happened to the aircraft? That's not on your list right now, Lena said. I need to know if it was mechanical or pilot. Ryan. She used his name deliberately. Look at me. He did. Right now you have one job. That's it. Can you do that? He was quiet for a moment. Yeah. Good. She heard Dr. Rao on the radio with the ear specialist they'd called in from Denver General. They'd need imaging on the right ear, possibly a consult for round window rupture, and the barotrauma protocol was going to require close monitoring overnight at minimum. What she did not hear was Dr. Hale's voice. She noticed that. Not with satisfaction, exactly. With the specific, careful attention she gave to things that mattered. In the elevator down from the roof, Major Greer stood beside her and didn't say anything for 2 floors. Then, how long have you been here? 3 years. He nodded slowly. As a nurse. It wasn't quite a question. As a nurse, she confirmed. Another floor. I'm going to need to make some calls in the morning, he said. Okay. You're aware there are people who've been looking for you. She watched the floor numbers change. I know. And you didn't make it easy. I wasn't trying to. The doors opened on the 2nd floor. She stepped out with the cart and didn't look back at him, but she heard him stay in the elevator, going down, probably to make those calls he'd mentioned, probably to talk to people she hadn't spoken to in years. She set the cart at the nursing station and pulled Captain Keller's intake form. Behind her, the trauma bay was still running at full noise, someone ordering imaging, the ear specialist on speakerphone. The particular organized chaos of a critical case in the first hour that you don't fully exhale through until the patient is stable and you can breathe again. She started on the intake form. At the East Wing nursing station, the incident report from earlier was still in her drawer where she'd left it. She'd finish it before the shift ended. She always finished. It was 22 minutes later when she was checking the barotrauma monitoring protocol printout against the medication orders that the doors to the trauma bay opened and a different set of footsteps came through. Heavier, more deliberate, the specific cadence of people who were used to their arrival meaning something. She looked up. 4 of them. Dress uniforms, not flight suits. 2 colonels by the rank insignia she could read from the nursing station even without glasses she didn't need. One of them was carrying a folder with a red stripe across the top that she recognized from a time in her life she hadn't thought about in a long time. The other one, she saw his face and felt something go quiet inside her. Brigadier General Marcus Aldrin. She hadn't seen him since Fort Bragg, 2019, the last week before she'd signed the paperwork and walked out of the world that had defined the previous decade of her life. He'd been a colonel then. He was broader in the face now, more gray at the temples, but he had the same way of standing that she'd always found vaguely exhausting, perfectly upright in a way that looked less like good posture and more like someone had removed his ability to slouch. He saw her. He stopped. And then, in the middle of Horizon Ridge Military Medical Center, in the hallway outside the trauma bay where 3 hours ago she'd been told to stay in her lane, Brigadier General Marcus Aldrin came to attention and saluted her. The hallway went absolutely silent. Lena set the printout down on the desk very carefully. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the colonels behind him who had done the same, all of them at attention, all of them waiting. And somewhere down the hallway, she heard Dr. Victor Hale's voice stop mid-sentence. She hadn't wanted this. She specifically hadn't wanted this. The reason she'd spent 3 years under the radar, filing incident reports, monitoring vitals, doing the work no one looked at, was precisely because she hadn't wanted to be found. Hadn't wanted the past to catch up to the present and demand a reckoning that would disrupt the quiet she'd built around herself like a wall. But Ryan Keller was alive because the wall had come down tonight. And Victor Hale was watching from 40 feet away, and she could feel the specific quality of his silence without turning to look at him. She held Aldrin's gaze. "At ease," she said quietly. He lowered his hand, and the ghost of something, not a smile, but close to one, moved across his face. "Viper," he said, "we need to talk." "Viper," he said, "we need to talk." She didn't answer right away. The hallway was still holding its breath. She could feel it. All those people frozen in the specific paralysis of witnessing something they couldn't yet categorize. The residents near the trauma bay doors. The 2 charge nurses who'd stopped mid-stride. Somewhere behind her, she heard a clipboard get set down on a counter with more care than clipboards usually received. Aldrin hadn't moved. He was still watching her with that measured patience she remembered. The kind that didn't look patient at all from the outside but was, underneath, made of iron. "Not here," she said. "No," he agreed. "Not here." She looked at the monitoring printout on the desk. She looked at the medication orders. She flagged the file, noted the handoff in the margin the way she always did, and set it in the basket for the night charge. Then she picked up her badge and walked toward him. The colonels fell back half a step without being told to. Old habit, she thought. Make room for the general and whoever he's talking to. She felt Hale's stare like a second shadow the whole length of the hallway. Oh. The conference room on the 3rd floor was used during the day for department meetings, and smelled, always, faintly, of burned coffee and dry erase markers. At 1 in the morning, it was empty and cold, and the overhead lights were the harsh kind that made everyone look like they hadn't slept. Aldrin dismissed the colonels at the door. They left without protest, which told her something about the conversation to come. He wanted it off the record, or at least off the official record, which was a distinction she understood better than most. He sat across from her without taking off his coat. She hadn't offered to take it. "You look good," he said. "You look tired," she said. "It's been a long 8 months." He put the red-striped folder on the table but didn't open it. "I'm going to start by telling you we didn't know you were here until 4 days ago." "What happened 4 days ago?" Keller's squadron filed their training rotation manifest with Peterson Medical, cross-referenced with regional trauma centers for pre-certification. "Your name came up as staff," he paused. "Your current name." "I didn't change my name." "No, but you changed your license registry state, your contact information, your NOK listing, and your employment history documentation going back to 2020. You made yourself difficult to find without making yourself impossible to find, which means you didn't want to disappear completely." He said it without accusation, more like someone noting the math of a thing. "You just wanted to be left alone." She didn't respond to that because there wasn't anything to say to it that wasn't obvious. He pulled a single sheet from inside the folder and set it in front of her. Black and white, dense text, the formatting she recognized as an incident investigation summary, the kind that opened formal military inquiries. "Keller's malfunction wasn't random," Aldrin said. "The F-22 variant he was flying had a maintenance cycle flag that should have grounded it. The flag was cleared 4 days before the training rotation. The person who cleared it was a civilian contractor assigned to Peterson's maintenance oversight office." She read the page. She read it again. "Who authorized the contractor?" "That's what we're investigating." His voice was even, but she'd known him long enough to hear what was under it. The contractor's credentials were signed off by the base's medical readiness liaison. She looked up. That's a medical position. It is. Medical readiness liaisons don't sign off on maintenance contractor credentials. They don't, he said, unless they have a secondary administrative role that was quietly added to their file, which this one did as of 8 months ago. She sat with that for a moment. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, she could see the parking lot lights, and beyond them, the dark bulk of the Rockies against a slightly lighter sky. You think someone deliberately cleared a flagged aircraft for a training flight. I think someone cleared a flagged aircraft, and I think that someone had a reason to want Keller in the air in that specific aircraft on that specific day. He retrieved the sheet without ceremony. I can't tell you more than that right now. What I can tell you is that the investigation is active. It goes above my clearance level to authorize disclosure, and the reason I'm sitting in front of you instead of a JAG officer is that Keller is alive because of what happened tonight. Lena absorbed that, sorted through it the way she sorted through complicated cases, not rushing toward the conclusion, staying with each piece until it settled. You need me for something specific, she said. You saved his life. He's going to want to talk to you before he talks to anyone else. And right now, the people running this investigation need an intermediary they trust near him while he's in this facility. He looked at her steadily. You're the only person in this building who has the clearance and the proximity. I'm a nurse, Marcus. You're the only person in this building with a TSSCI that's still technically active because you never formally deactivated it when you resigned your commission. She hadn't known that. She'd assumed it had lapsed. She filed that away. You want me to babysit a crash investigation witness. I want you to be the person he can talk to who understands what he might have seen before that aircraft went down. He stood, picked up the folder. I'm not ordering you. You're a civilian, and I have no authority over you, but I am asking. She looked at the table. There was a ring stain from someone's coffee cup, slightly irregular, dried, and pale. She'd been staring at it without realizing. I'll need access to his chart without going through Hale. Dr. Rao has been briefed. She's your point of contact. She nodded once. He moved toward the door and she stayed seated, which was not a dynamic he was used to, and which, she suspected, was why he stopped with his hand on the frame. Lena, he said. I know, she said. He left. She sat in the cold conference room for another 4 minutes, alone, and let the silence be what it was. Then she got up and went back to work. Ryan Keller was in room 214, which was a standard care room rather than the ICU because his vitals had stabilized enough during the first hour that Dr. Rao had made the call to move him out of the trauma bay. Smart call. The trauma bay was still running noise from 2 other cases that had come in while the ejection situation was consuming all available attention, a car accident and a chest pain complaint, and the quieter environment would help Keller's monitoring more than the proximity to the crash cart that ICU proximity provided. He was awake when she came in. That surprised her slightly. She'd expected sedation for the pain management, but his chart showed he'd refused the stronger option and was on a lower-grade analgesic instead. His right ear was packed with dressing. His left shoulder had a pressure bandage over the suit seam injury. He looked, she thought, like someone had taken a normal person and put them through a very specific kind of machine that left the outside mostly intact but rearranged everything underneath. He looked at her when she came in. You're the one who talked me down on the mountain. Yes. Through the radio, you told me to breathe regular. You remembered that. He tried to smile and it went a little sideways because of the pain. Hard to forget. Okafor's got a voice like a gravel truck. Yours was different. He shifted against the pillow and winced. They told me you're a nurse here. I am. They also told me other things. He watched her with the slightly unfocused clarity of someone running on adrenaline come-down and low-grade medication. That true? Depends on what they told you. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the room, she could hear the hallway sounds. The squeak of a cartwheel, someone's radio, the baseline hum of a hospital at 2 a.m. Before the malfunction, he said carefully. Before the system went, I saw something on the instruments that didn't match the maintenance report I'd been given. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat down. Not closer to him, not farther. The right distance for a conversation you needed to go slowly. Tell me what you saw, she said. He told her. It took 11 minutes. She didn't take notes. She'd learned a long time ago that a notepad in your hand changes what people say. And she listened the way she'd been trained to listen, not for the words, but for what the words were arranged around. The shape of the absence. What he described was an instrument panel that had shown a specific pressure discrepancy in the left fuel management system 4 minutes before the malfunction registered on ground control's monitoring. A discrepancy that should have triggered an automatic alert to the base maintenance team. An alert that, as far as he knew, had never come through. She understood then what the investigation was looking for. Not just who had cleared the maintenance flag, who had disabled the automatic alert system. Those were two separate actions. They required two separate people or one person with access to two separate systems. "Did you report the instrument reading before the malfunction?" she asked. "I called it in on approach comms. The response I got was..." He stopped, pressed his jaw together. "The response was that my readings were within tolerance, to continue the mission profile." "Who responded?" "Ground control officer. I don't have a name. It was routine traffic." She nodded. "Okay. Is it okay?" She looked at him. He was 31 and he'd nearly died 6 hours ago, and he was lying in a hospital room asking someone he'd met through a radio if the information he was carrying was going to matter. She recognized that specific exhaustion. She'd felt it herself, on the other side of a different set of events years ago. "Yes," she said. "It matters. Everything you just told me matters." He exhaled, and the exhale went on for a long time. She stayed another 20 minutes, monitoring his vitals without making a production of it, checking the ear dressing once, adjusting the pillow angle because he'd been unconsciously bracing his neck in a way that would cause problems by morning. When she left, he was nearly asleep, which was what she'd been working toward without telling him that's what she was doing. In the hallway, she found Major Greer waiting 6 feet from the door. "Well," he said, "he needs rest, and he needs a JAG officer in the morning." She kept walking. "Make sure whoever comes in has read the maintenance flag documentation first. He'll know if they haven't." Greer fell into step beside her. "What else?" "The automatic alert system on the aircraft needs to be pulled and examined by someone who isn't assigned to Peterson's maintenance chain." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "That's a significant inference from a conversation that just happened." "Yes," she said. "It is." He peeled off at the stairwell, and she continued toward the East Wing, where she had 2 patients who hadn't seen their nurse in 4 hours and a medication round that was 40 minutes behind. The East Wing at 2:30 in the morning was quiet in the specific way that night shifts got quiet. Not peaceful, just the absence of the acute crises that defined the earlier hours, replaced by the slower rhythms of monitoring and maintenance and keeping things from getting worse, while everyone who made decisions was asleep. She did the medication round. She checked on Mr. Pellegrino in 108, who was post-surgical and sleeping badly, and on Mrs. Ewan in 112, who was 83 and never slept before 4 a.m. and who had opinions about the hospital television programming that she shared freely. "The man in the news," Mrs. Ewan said when Lena came in to check her IV. "He crashed his airplane." "He did. Is he all right?" "He's going to be." Mrs. Ewan considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. "My husband flew. Navy. He said the worst part was never the flying, it was the paperwork after." She patted Lena's hand where it rested on the IV line. "You look like you've had a night." "I've had a night," Lena agreed. She was back at the nursing station writing her notes when she heard the footsteps coming down the hallway. Not the soft-soled shuffle of night staff, but the hard-heeled, deliberate step she'd been half expecting since the conference room. Dr. Victor Hale. No coat. Still in his scrubs. It was almost 3 a.m., and he looked like he'd been sitting somewhere trying to decide what to do, and had finally decided. He stopped at the nursing station and looked at her. "I'd like to talk," he said. She kept her eyes on the chart. "My break's at 4. Now, Marlowe." She set down her pen, looked at him. I was a man who was used to looks moving away from him, used to the particular authority that comes from institutional position and physical presence, and a record of being the person who decided things. What he was looking at now was something he didn't have a category for, and she could see that registering on his face in real time, the slight tightening around the eyes, the jaw working. "Dr. Hale," she said, "I have patience." "What you have," he said, keeping his voice low, "is an explanation you owe me." She was quiet for a moment. The overhead light hummed. Down the hall, Mrs. Yuen's television murmured too low to hear the words. "I don't owe you anything," she said. It wasn't hostile, it was just accurate. His face went through something complicated. "You've been working in my department for 3 years, under my supervision. Under your supervision," she said. "Doing my job, every day, correctly." She picked up her pen. "If you have a patient concern, I'm available. If you want to discuss what happened tonight, my answer is the same as it would have been this morning. I told you the extraction protocol needed to change. You told me to stay in my lane. I'm in my lane right now. Is there something else?" He was breathing through his nose in the way that meant he was controlling something with effort. "Those were military officers. They saluted you." "They did." "What did you tell them? In that conference room?" She looked at him for a long moment, and she let the silence do what silence does when the person on the other side of it is waiting for something they're not going to get. "Good night, Dr. Hale," she said. He stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he left. She picked up the chart and found her place and continued writing. Her handwriting was steady. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about having done hard things in hard places. It reset your baseline for what steady needed to mean. She was 15 minutes from the end of her shift when the charge nurse from the ICU, a compact and perpetually efficient woman named Dorsey, appeared at her elbow. "Marlowe, the military people are asking for you again." "Which military people?" "The ones who've been in the second-floor conference room for the last 2 hours. There are more of them now." Dorsey paused. "There's also someone from the hospital board. Dr. Rao has been in there since 4. Lena filed the last chart. "Is Hale in there?" "No, he left the building at 3:15. Dorsey hesitated, which was unusual because Dorsey did not generally hesitate. "Marlowe, what's going on?" She thought about how to answer that and settled on the simplest version. "Someone made a mistake," she said, "and now they're figuring out how big it is." She handed the completed charts across the desk and walked toward the conference room. There were 7 people inside when she opened the door: Aldrin and both colonels from earlier, Major Greer, Dr. Rao, a woman in civilian clothes who had the specific bearing of someone with a federal ID she wasn't displaying, and a man she didn't recognize who was sitting apart from the others with his own folder and his own coffee, and the expression of someone who'd been in enough of these rooms to find them unremarkable. Nobody was talking when she walked in. They'd been talking. The room had that quality of a conversation that had stopped very recently. But they weren't anymore. Aldrin looked at her. Something had shifted since the hallway. He was more tired and more taut at the same time. "Sit down, Lena," he said. She sat. He opened the red-striped folder, and this time he took out not one sheet but a small stack. "The maintenance contractor whose credentials were cleared 8 months ago," he said. "We have the authorization chain. Full documentation. The civilian liaison who signed off on the secondary administrative role that allowed the clearance. We've identified him." He set the first sheet in front of her. "He's a hospital administrator. Medical Readiness Liaison for the Peterson Facility, secondary appointment." She read the name. She read it again. The room was very quiet. "Lena," Rao said from across the table, and her voice had a careful quality that said she was paying close attention to what happened next. "Do you recognize that name?" She set the sheet down on the table precisely, aligned it with the edge. "Yes," she said. "From where?" She looked up. She looked at Aldrin, and then at Rao, and then at the woman with the federal ID who still hadn't introduced herself. "Horizon Ridge," she said. "He was on the board's oversight committee. He was the one who approved the hospital's partnership with Peterson Air Force Base 3 years ago." She paused. "He was also the person who handled the staffing review that classified me as non-specialized care when I was hired." Nobody spoke for a moment. The man with his own folder and his own coffee, the one she didn't recognize, leaned forward slightly. He set down the coffee. He had the practiced stillness of someone who asked questions for a living. "Ms. Marlowe," he said, "how familiar are you with the hospital's administrative relationship with the Peterson Contractor Network?" She looked at him, and something cold moved through her. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of where this was going, of how much larger this was than a crashed aircraft and a salute in a hospital hallway and an arrogant surgeon who didn't want a nurse in his briefing room. This wasn't about her anymore. Maybe it never had been. "Who are you?" she said. He reached inside his jacket and set a credential on the table. Department of Defense Inspector General. She looked at the credential. She looked at the stack of papers in front of Aldrin. She thought about Ryan Keller in room 214, telling her about an instrument reading that someone had told him was within tolerance. She thought about the maintenance flag that had been cleared, the alert system that hadn't triggered, 2 separate actions, 1 person or 2. And she thought about the name on the sheet, the name she'd recognized. "Tell me what you know about the hospital's contract review process," the investigator said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to need some coffee," she said. She wasn't on shift anymore. She hadn't been for the past 11 minutes, but she sat in the chair and she didn't leave. And when the investigator pushed the first document across the table toward her, she pulled it close and started to read. In room 214 down the hall, Captain Ryan Keller had finally fallen asleep. At the nursing station, the new shift was taking over with the particular organized chaos of transition. The sun was beginning to separate the sky from the mountains outside the conference room window. Just barely, just the first suggestion of gray edging up behind the peaks. And somewhere in the hospital building, a door that had been closed and locked and left alone for 3 years had come open and let the light in, and there was no putting it back. But in the morning, when Denver woke up and the shift changed fully, and the hospital moved into its daytime self, a different door was going to open. Lena didn't know it yet, but the investigator's next document was going to have a second name on it, a name she recognized even better than the first one. The investigator's next document was going to have a second name on it. She didn't have to wait long. He slid it across the table without ceremony, the way you hand someone a thing when you already know what their reaction is going to be, and you want to give them space to have it without an audience leaning in. She appreciated that, even if she didn't show it. The name was Dr. Victor Hale. She read the full entry. Secondary administrative appointment, same classification as the first. The board liaison whose name she'd already seen. Co-signatory on the contractor credential approval. Date of appointment, 22 months ago. Well inside his tenure at Horizon, well inside the period she'd been working under him. She set the document down. "Tell me what the co-signatory role authorized him to do," she said. The investigator, his name was Farrell, he'd introduced himself after she'd asked for coffee, laced his fingers on the table. It authorized him to approve medical readiness certifications for contracted personnel operating within a joint civilian-military facility boundary. In practical terms, it meant he could sign off on contractor access to classified sections of Peterson's medical administrative network, and the maintenance contractor whose credentials were cleared had access to the electronic maintenance log system as part of that certification, Farrell said, including the authority to update flag status on individual aircraft within the training rotation schedule. She heard Rao exhale slowly across the table. She heard Aldrin shift in his chair. She did not exhale. She thought. The architecture of it was becoming visible now. Not the full structure, not yet, but the load-bearing pieces. Someone had wanted Ryan Keller in a specific aircraft on a specific day. To make that happen, they'd needed 2 things: a maintenance flag cleared and an automatic alert suppressed. The first required contractor access to the log system. The second required someone with administrator-level access to the aircraft's monitoring relay, which ran through Peterson's Medical Readiness Network. Medical Readiness Network, the same system Hale's co-signatory role gave him access to. "You're not here because of the crash," she said to Farrell. He didn't confirm or deny it, which was its own kind of confirmation. "How long has the investigation been running?" she asked. 8 months, he said. 8 months. The same timeline as the administrative appointments. She thought about that. "And Keller," she said, "was he the target, or was he incidental?" Farrell looked at her for a long moment. "That's what we're trying to determine, which is part of why your account of what he told you last night is significant." She turned to Aldrin. "He told me he called in the instrument discrepancy on approach comms and was told his readings were within tolerance." "We know," Aldrin said. "We pulled the comms log an hour ago. The response he received didn't come from the assigned ground control officer on duty." She heard what he wasn't saying. "Someone else responded on that channel," she said. "Using the correct authentication code for the duty officer. Yes." He said it flatly, the way you say things that make you tired to say them. The woman with the federal ID, who still hadn't given her name, which Lena had stopped expecting, leaned forward for the first time. Ms. Marlowe, what we need to understand is the scope of Dr. Hale's access within this facility. Specifically, what patient records, administrative files, and interfacility communications he would have had routine access to during his tenure. He's the chief surgeon, Lena said. His access is broad enough to access historical training rotation manifests submitted to Horizon Ridge for pre-certification? She understood the question immediately. The training rotation manifest. The one that had cross-referenced her name 4 days ago. The one that had flagged her presence at this facility to Aldrin's team. If he saw that manifest, she said slowly, he would have known I was on staff before your team did. Silence. He's been in this building for 3 years, she said. With me. More silence. She thought about all the ways he'd had to interfere, to observe, to know things about her work that she'd never thought twice about sharing, because it was a hospital, and information moved through hospitals the way water moved through soil. She thought about the staffing review that had classified her as non-specialized care, the administrative decision that had kept her visible but manageable. She'd always assumed it was standard bureaucracy. She'd never wondered who'd initiated it. I need to know, she said, and her voice was very level, whether I have been under active surveillance. Nobody answered immediately, which was an answer. Rao spoke. Lena, everything we're doing right now is to protect you and to build the case properly. That's not what I asked. Farrell looked at his folder. There is evidence that your personnel file was accessed through the facility's administrative portal on 6 separate occasions in the past 18 months. Each access was logged to Dr. Hale's administrator credentials. 6 times. She put that somewhere and left it there for now. All right, she said. All right? Rao repeated. I mean, I understand. She pulled the next document from the stack toward her. Show me the rest. By 7 a.m., the conference room had gone through 2 more pots of coffee and accumulated 3 additional people. A JAG officer named Captain Wilder, who'd driven up from Peterson in the dark, a second civilian from Farrell's office, and a hospital administrator named Solace, who looked like she'd been expecting this day for some time and was visibly relieved it had finally arrived. What came together in that room over the next 2 hours was a picture that was both cleaner and uglier than Lena had expected. Hale and the board liaison, his name was Gareth Murdoch, she'd learned, a man she'd met twice in 3 years and found unremarkable both times, had been running what Farrell's team described as an access laundering arrangement. They used the joint civilian-military facility structure at Horizon Ridge to gain administrative rights within Peterson's network that neither of them should have held. Those rights had been used over 8 months to manipulate contractor credentials, move access authorizations, and most significantly, create an off-record communication pathway that could operate within Peterson's official channels using legitimate authentication codes. The crash wasn't random. The maintenance flag clearance and the alert suppression and the false ground control response were the moving parts of something that had been planned carefully and that had very nearly worked. Ryan Keller wasn't supposed to survive the ejection. That was the part that sat in the room like something with its own weight. Why Keller? Lena said. Wilder, the JAG officer, answered. We believe Captain Keller became aware of financial irregularities in Peterson's contractor billing system during a routine audit he participated in 4 months ago. He flagged them informally to his squadron commander. The report was logged, and then it disappeared. Someone deleted it, redacted it from the filing system, made it look like it had never been submitted. Wilder folded his hands. Keller didn't push it. He moved on. We believe whoever redacted the report assumed the problem was contained. But it wasn't, she said. Keller kept his own notes, outside the system. Wilder allowed himself the small, grim expression. He's careful. She thought about the pilot in room 214, asking about his instruments when he'd been lying in a hospital bed 6 hours after nearly dying. Careful was a word for it. He's also, she said, currently in this building. Yes. And Hale left the building at 3:15 this morning. We're aware. He's being located. She didn't like the word located. It meant they hadn't found him yet. She looked at Aldrin. He gave her the small nod that meant he was tracking the same thing. I want someone on Keller's room, she said. Already positioned, Greer said from the corner where he'd been sitting quietly for an hour. Peterson sent 2 people up overnight. They're in plain clothes. She filed that. Then she looked at Solis, the hospital administrator, who had been mostly quiet through the meeting except for a few moments of documentation and one very pointed question about the board oversight structure. "The staffing review," Lena said to her. "The one that classified me as non-specialized care when I was hired. Who initiated it?" Solis didn't look away. "It was submitted through the Medical Readiness Liaison Office." "Murdoch." "Yes." "On Hale's recommendation." Solis hesitated. "That's what the documentation indicates." So it had been deliberate from the start. Not malice, exactly, or not only malice. More like the specific calculation of someone who'd identified a variable they didn't want moving freely and had found the neatest administrative solution for containing it. Keep her in the building where she could be observed. Keep her classified in a role that limited her access and her authority. Keep her where she was useful but small. It hadn't worked. But the attempt had shaped 3 years of her life, and she sat with that for exactly as long as it took to file it and move on. "What do you need from me for the formal record?" she asked Farrell. "A signed witness account of the events beginning with the emergency call last night, your conversation with Keller, the conference room meeting, and a formal statement regarding any communications, administrative interactions, or professional incidents you can recall involving Dr. Hale and the contractor network over the past 3 years. I'll need a few hours." "We have time." She thought, "Do we?" But she said, "I'll start on it now." She wrote for 2 hours in a smaller room off the main conference room, alone with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold, and then got replaced and went cold again. She was methodical about it. Dates, interactions, observations, the texture of what she'd noticed and hadn't thought to question, the way Hale had redirected certain contractor-related conversations, the 2 times she'd seen him in administrative sections of the building that didn't relate to his surgical responsibilities, the staffing review she'd simply accepted as bureaucratic routine. She had a good memory. She'd trained it to be good, in a profession where remembering the exact sequence of events was the difference between a correct report and a damaging one. She'd been writing for 90 minutes when the knock came. Greer opened the door. His face had the quality of someone delivering information they'd been asked not to rush. "They found Hale," he said. "Where?" "Parking structure off Spear Boulevard. He was in his car." A pause. "He's in custody. He tried to access Peterson's administrative network remotely using a personal device. The attempt was flagged by the monitoring system Farrell's team put on the network 48 hours ago." She set down her pen. "He tried to access it this morning," she said, "at 6:52 a.m. She thought about what was on Peterson's network that he'd want to reach. The contractor credentials, the communication logs, the authentication records, any one of which, if pulled or altered before the investigation team secured them, could complicate the case considerably. "Did he get in?" she asked. "No, the monitoring system locked his credentials on the first attempt." She exhaled through her nose. "Good. There's something else." Greer came fully into the room and closed the door. He was holding his own folder now, not Aldrin's, something he'd put together himself from the look of it, papers that had the slightly uneven quality of things printed in a hurry. When they searched his vehicle, they found a second device. Not his personal phone. A burner, prepaid. It had been used twice in the last week, both calls to the same number. "Do you have the number?" "We're tracing it now." He opened the folder. But the second call was made at 3:17 a.m., 2 minutes after he'd left the hospital building. She thought about that. 2 minutes after she'd told him goodnight, and he'd stood there for 3 extra seconds and then left. "He called someone as soon as he left," she said. "Yes." "And you think whoever he called knows the investigation is active?" "We think it's possible, yes." She stood up from the table. The room felt smaller than it had 2 minutes ago. "Farrell needs to know about this right now," she said. "He already does. They're working the trace." Greer hesitated. "There's also a development with Keller." Something shifted in her attention. "He's fine medically," Greer said quickly. "His vitals are stable. Dr. Rao checked him at 7. But he's been asking for you specifically, and about 20 minutes ago he told the plainclothes officer outside his room that he remembered something from the crash that he hadn't told you last night." She was already moving toward the door. "Something he didn't remember?" she said. "Something he didn't say?" Greer said. "He said, and I'm quoting, 'There was a second voice.'" She stopped. "On the comms," she said, before the false ground control response. He says there was a second voice he didn't recognize, and it wasn't ground control, and it wasn't his wingman. He heard it for approximately 4 seconds before the malfunction hit and he lost the channel. 4 seconds was nothing. 4 seconds was everything. He has to give that to Wilder immediately, she said. He won't. He says he'll talk to you. She looked at Greer. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by the direction this morning was taking. She left the small room and moved quickly down the hallway toward 214, and as she turned the corner toward the patient wing, she nearly walked directly into Dr. Annika Rao, who was coming from the other direction at a pace that matched Lena's and wearing an expression that did not belong on someone whose shift had just started. I need to tell you something, Rao said, falling into step beside her without slowing. Walk and talk. The hospital board called an emergency session for 9 a.m. Solis briefed the chair at 7:30. Rao glanced sideways at her. They're going to suspend Hale's surgical privileges pending the investigation, which is standard procedure and which Solis already has the paperwork for. But they're also going to review the original staffing classification that placed you in non-specialized care. Lena kept walking. How is that relevant to the investigation? It's not. It's relevant to you. Rao paused. They're going to reclassify your position, retroactively, with back compensation for the grade differential over 3 years. She processed that. It shouldn't have landed the way it did. After everything else that had been said in the last 6 hours, it was administratively minor, but it did land somewhere below the tactical, in the part of her she didn't usually examine in well-lit hallways. 3 years of being classified as ordinary. Corrected in a meeting she wouldn't even attend. That's fine, she said. It's more than fine. Rao. She stopped outside room 214. I need to talk to Keller. Rao stopped with her. The hallway outside 214 had the slightly different quality of a space that had quietly acquired 2 extra people. She clocked the plainclothes officers without looking directly at them. A woman reading a tablet near the water station, and a man with a maintenance lanyard who hadn't done any maintenance in the last hour. Are you okay? Rao asked. It was a simple question asked in a simple way, and sometimes those were the hardest ones. I'll be okay when I know what he heard on that channel, Lena said. She pushed the door open. Keller was sitting up. Someone had brought him a coffee he hadn't touched, and a phone he also hadn't touched, and he was looking at the wall opposite his bed with the focused expression of someone trying to hold on to a specific memory before it slipped sideways. He looked at her when she came in. You're here. I'm here. Greer said you remembered something. I've been trying to get it clear since about 4 a.m. He pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his good ear, a habit she recognized, the physical attempt to improve mental clarity. On the comms, right before the ground control response that told me my readings were normal, there was a different voice. It was on the channel, not on a separate frequency. It was in the system, like it had access to the channel, but it cut out almost immediately, like someone had switched into the channel and then realized they were live. 4 seconds. Maybe less. I'd been focused on my instruments. It caught my attention because it was wrong. The wrong cadence for ground traffic. It wasn't a call sign. It wasn't a standard check-in. It was a partial sentence. She stayed very still. What did it say? He looked at her. It said, and I've been going over this since 4 a.m. because I want to be sure. It said, confirm Keller is on profile. And then it cut out. Confirm Keller is on profile. Not is Keller on profile. Not a question. A statement looking for confirmation. An instruction passed between 2 people who were monitoring his flight and needed to know he was where they'd planned for him to be. Was it a male voice? She asked. Yes. Older. Not military. The phrasing was right, but the delivery was off. Like someone who knew how to sound like they belonged on that channel, but wasn't used to it. Not a pilot. Not a ground controller. Someone who'd been trained on the vocabulary but wasn't operational, medical, administrative. She thought of Hale. She thought of the call made from a burner phone at 3:17 in the morning. 2 voices. Hale's was one. The one Keller had heard on the channel was the other. Ryan, she said, I need you to repeat exactly what you just told me to the JAG officer, Captain Wilder. He's in this building right now. I know. He'd said he'd talk to her first. I needed to say it out loud once to someone who wasn't going to make it official immediately. Because when it becomes official, it stops being just something I remember and starts being evidence. And evidence is what protects you, she said. He looked at her. He was 31 and he'd nearly died, and he was carrying something that was about to get heavier, not lighter, and he knew it. Yeah, he said. Okay. She went to the door and opened it and told the plainclothes officer to get Wilder. Then she came back in and stood near the window because the room needed the extra space for what was about to happen in it. While they waited, Keller looked at the coffee someone had brought him. Then he looked at her. The voice, he said. On the channel. I've been trying to figure out if I'd heard it before. She looked at him. Have you? He turned the coffee cup slowly with his fingers, not drinking it. Once, he said. In a briefing room at Peterson. 8 months ago, during the contractor review meeting where I first noticed the billing irregularities. He paused. I don't have a name for it. I was new to the rotation, but I'm not certain, but I think the voice belonged to someone who was introduced to us as a hospital administrator, a civilian. The door opened. Wilder came in with a junior officer and a recorder. And in that moment, before the formal statement began and the room became official and everything said in it became part of the permanent record, Lena understood with absolute clarity what the second name on Farrell's document meant. It wasn't just a co-signatory, it was a coordinator. Someone who had stood in a briefing room 8 months ago and heard a young pilot notice something he shouldn't have noticed, and who had made a decision in that moment that had set everything else in motion. And that someone, the voice on the channel, the civilian who'd said, confirm Keller is on profile. She didn't know his face, but she knew who to ask. She stepped back from the bed to let Wilder take her place, and as she turned toward the door, she felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She pulled it out. A text from Greer, 4 words. Trace came back. Murdoch. She read it twice. Murdoch. The board liaison. The man she'd found unremarkable in 2 brief meetings over 3 years. The man whose name had been first on Farrell's document. The man who had initiated the staffing review that had kept her classified as ordinary. The man whose voice had been on Ryan Keller's comms channel, asking someone to confirm that the pilot was on profile and in position and unaware of what was about to happen to him. She typed back, "Where is he now?" Greer's reply took 19 seconds. That's the problem. That's the problem. She stared at the 2 words for 3 seconds, then typed, "Elaborate." Greer's response came back in pieces, the way messages did when someone was moving and typing simultaneously. Left his residence sometime between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., car still in driveway. Phone went dark at 11:47 p.m. Same time, Hale made the burner call. No outbound flights under his name, no hotel check-ins flagged yet. She read it through once. Then she walked out of room 214 and into the hallway, where the plainclothes officer near the water station looked up from her tablet, and Lena said quietly and directly, "Double the door coverage. Now. Nobody in without Wilder's clearance or mine." The officer didn't ask questions. That was the thing about people who'd been trained correctly. They recognized a tone that wasn't asking. Lena was already moving toward the stairwell. Murdoch had known since 3:17 this morning that something had gone wrong. Hale's call from the parking structure had been the warning 2 minutes after leaving the building, which meant the moment Hale had understood the salute in the hallway, the moment he'd seen military officers redirecting a hospital crisis around him and had started calculating, he'd reached for the burner and made the call. That was the timeline. That was the 8-minute gap between when Hale left and when Murdoch's phone went dark. Murdoch had turned off his phone and walked out of his house and disappeared, which meant he'd had a contingency, which meant somewhere in the 18 months of this arrangement, he'd planned for the possibility that it would collapse. She needed Farrell. She needed him now. She found him in the main conference room with 2 of his people, a laptop, and the expression of a man who had been awake for 23 hours and was running on the specific adrenaline that comes from a case that's moving faster than you planned for. "Murdoch is in the wind," she said. "I know." He didn't look up. "We flagged his residence 6 minutes ago. His wife says she woke at 5 and the bed was empty. She thought he'd gone in early." "Does she know about the investigation?" "She does now." He said it without particular inflection, which was its own kind of answer about how that conversation had gone. "We have people at the bus station, the train station, and we've got a bolo out with Denver PD and State Patrol. He doesn't have access to his personal accounts. We froze them as a precautionary measure at 7 a.m. when Hale was taken into custody. But he knew that might happen. Yes. So he has cash, or access to something we haven't identified. Farrell finally looked up. Possibly, which is why what I actually need from you right now isn't Murdoch's location. We'll find him. It's a matter of hours. What I need is the administrative access map. I need to know every system he could have reached through his board liaison role and through the co-signatory arrangement with Hale. Because if he had any ability to alter or delete documentation before he left last night, the investigation record could be incomplete, she said. Exactly. She sat down across from him. She hadn't slept. She was aware of that the way you're aware of a low-grade sound, present, consistent, not yet disabling. She'd functioned on worse. She'd functioned on 4 hours in a forward operating base in conditions that made a hospital conference room feel like a resort, and she could function now. Walk me through the administrative structure of the board liaison role, she said. Everything it touched. I'll tell you what I've observed operationally over the past 3 years, and we'll cross-reference. They worked for 40 minutes. She was more useful than she expected to be, not because she'd been watching Murdoch specifically, but because she'd spent 3 years being invisible in a building where visibility was currency, and invisible people notice things that visible people assume aren't being tracked. She remembered the twice she'd seen his name on internal memos. The department head's meeting in January of the previous year, where his role had been referenced in the context of Peterson's medical readiness budget. The way Hale had handled contractor-related paperwork differently from clinical paperwork, a different filing system, a different cabinet locked where the clinical files weren't. Farrell's second civilian produced a diagram. Administrative access points mapped against the timeline. It wasn't elegant. It had the quality of something assembled fast, with gaps where the information was still coming in. But it was enough to show what Murdoch could have reached. The monitoring relay logs for the aircraft, the contractor credential system, the communication authentication records, and she saw this and felt her attention sharpen. The personnel file archive for joint civilian-military facilities, which included her own file. He could have altered my file, she said. Could have. Whether he did is what we're verifying now. Farrell's expression didn't change, but his voice had a careful quality. Is there anything in your personnel history with the Air Force that would be significant if it were altered or removed? She thought about what a careful man with administrative access and 8 months of preparation might decide to change. My combat medic certification records, she said. My deployment history. The incident reports from my last posting. She paused. And my separation paperwork. If someone altered the circumstances of my resignation from active service, reclassified it as a discharge, changed the terms. It would affect your standing as a credible witness, Farrell said. It would affect more than that. He made a note. He passed it to the second civilian without a word, and the second civilian left the room. Outside the conference room windows, Denver was fully awake now. The morning traffic on the streets below, the particular urban texture of a city that hadn't stopped while everything in this building had been burning. The mountains to the west were clear and sharp in the early light, the kind of visibility that came after weather moved through. Everything washed clean. She didn't feel clean. She felt like someone who had been inside a problem for long enough that the problem had started to feel like the natural state of things. Her phone buzzed. Rao. Board session moved to 8:30. They want you present, not optional. She typed back, when I'm done here. Rao. Lena. She put the phone in her pocket. The board session was held in the 4th floor executive conference room, which was a larger and more formally appointed version of every other conference room in the building. The same bad lighting, marginally better chairs. 7 board members. Solis. 2 attorneys. Aldrin, who had positioned himself at the far end of the table in a way that communicated he was present as an observer and not a participant, and whose presence alone probably changed the temperature in the room. Lena sat where Solis pointed, which was at the table rather than against the wall, which she took to mean this was not going to be the kind of meeting where she was informed of decisions already made. The board chair was a woman named Patricia Voss, mid-60s, silver hair, the specific economy of gesture that comes from running meetings for decades. She'd been chair for 6 years. She looked at Lena across the table with the expression of someone who was reassessing a situation they'd previously considered settled. Ms. Marlowe, Voss said. I want to begin by saying that the board has reviewed the documentation provided by Mr. Farrell's office this morning. We understand there are elements of this situation that are still under active investigation and that we cannot discuss in this forum. However, there are administrative matters within our authority that we can and should address immediately. Lena waited. The staffing classification assigned to you upon hiring has been reviewed. The board finds that it was applied incorrectly and that the documentation used to justify it was submitted through channels that we now understand to have been compromised. Voss didn't look away from her. We're authorizing an immediate reclassification to senior clinical specialist, retroactive to your date of hire, with the associated compensation adjustment. One of the attorneys slid a document across the table. Lena looked at it without touching it. The board also wants to formally acknowledge that Dr. Hale's conduct, both administratively and in his treatment of clinical staff, fell below the standards this institution is committed to maintaining. Voss paused. His surgical privileges have been suspended pending the investigation outcome. The board anticipates that suspension will become permanent. Anticipates. She noted the careful word. They didn't have the full picture yet. Nobody did. I appreciate the board's action, Lena said. I want to be clear about something. My concern right now is not the reclassification. Gareth Murdoch is unaccounted for, and until he's located, I'd like to know what additional security protocols this facility has in place for a situation where a former board liaison with administrative access might attempt to re-enter the building or access the network remotely. The room went slightly quiet in a way that suggested this wasn't the direction they'd expected the conversation to go. Voss looked at Solis. Solis looked at Lena with an expression that sat somewhere between respect and the mild exasperation of a person who has planned a meeting and found it departing from the plan. IT security has already locked Murdoch's credentials, Solis said. Physical access cards were deactivated at 7:30. And the secondary access pathway he used through the Peterson network interface, the one that ran through the medical readiness liaison system? A longer pause. I'm not certain, Solis began. It needs to be closed. Lena said it without heat, just as a statement of the next necessary thing. It's a separate system from your internal network, and it requires coordination with Peterson's IT security team. If Murdoch left last night with any remote access tools, and given that he had 8 months to prepare a contingency, I'd assume he did. That pathway is still potentially open. She wasn't doing this to embarrass anyone. She was doing it because it needed doing, and she was the person in the room who understood the architecture well enough to say it clearly. Voss looked at her for a long moment. I'll make sure that's addressed within the hour, Voss said. Thank you. The meeting lasted another 20 minutes, during which Lena signed the reclassification document, answered 2 questions from the attorneys about her personnel file and whether she'd been approached by Murdoch or Hale about any matters outside their professional roles. She had not. And listened to a brief statement about the board's commitment to a full internal review of the liaison appointment structure. When it was over, she walked out into the hallway and stood there for a moment, and Aldrin fell into step beside her with the ease of someone who'd been waiting exactly the right distance away. How are you doing? He said. I'm fine. You've been here since yesterday morning. I know when I got here. He was quiet for half a hallway. Then, the file alteration concern. Farrell's team has preliminary access to the Air Force Personnel Archive. Your records are intact. Murdoch didn't touch them. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully acknowledged was clenched. Okay, she said. Your separation documentation is clean. Your certification records are clean. Your deployment history is pretty. Marcus. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. I heard you. He nodded. Where are we on finding Murdoch? Denver PD found his car 20 minutes ago, long-term parking at Union Station. He bought a bus ticket to Pueblo under his wife's maiden name. They're checking passenger manifests now. He said it with the flat patience of a man who'd run enough operations to know that these sequences took the time they took. He's not gone. He's running, which is different. Running people make mistakes. They do. She started walking again. I need to check on Keller. Keller finished his statement with Wilder 40 minutes ago. The second voice confirmation is now formally in the record. Aldrin paused. He also asked about you 3 times during the session. Wilder said he kept checking the door. She didn't say anything to that. He's going to want to talk to you, Aldrin said. I know. I'll go when I'm done being needed somewhere else. You're not on shift. I'm aware. He stopped outside the stairwell. Lena, at some point today you have to stop moving. At some point today I will, she said, and pushed through the stairwell door. Asem. She found Wilder in the hallway outside 214, and he gave her the case status in 8 sentences because he was a JAG officer, and that was how JAG officers communicated when they were busy. Keller's statement was recorded and witnessed. The second voice identification, while not courtroom certain given the circumstances, was significant corroborating evidence. Hale had been transported to the federal holding facility in Denver at 9 a.m. and had declined to make a statement. Murdoch's location was narrowing. What's his condition? She asked, nodding toward 214. Keller? Medically stable, frustrated. Wilder allowed himself a small expression. He's an Air Force pilot. Being told to stay in a bed is not his preference. No, she agreed. It wouldn't be. She went in. The room looked the same as it had 2 hours ago, except the untouched coffee had been replaced with a fresh one that also appeared untouched, and Keller had clearly attempted to organize the situation around him. The bedside table had been tidied, the tablet positioned at an angle, small controls he had over a situation that was otherwise entirely out of his hands. She recognized that too. The ear specialist came back, he said when she walked in. He said the round window is intact. Barotrauma is going to resolve. Good. Said I might have some hearing sensitivity for a few weeks. He looked at her. Are they going to find him? She knew he meant Murdoch. Keller had been told, in careful and specific terms, what his statement meant and what it was part of, and he'd absorbed it with the focused attention of someone who understood that the briefing was the mission now. Yes, she said. You sound sure. He's on a bus to Pueblo under his wife's maiden name. He got a 12-hour head start and used it to go 2 hours south on a Greyhound. That's not a man with a sophisticated escape plan. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or the specific deflation of someone who has been bracing against a possibility and just gotten permission to let it down slightly. I keep thinking about the briefing room, he said, 8 months ago. I noticed the numbers were off. I told myself it was a filing error. He looked at the window. I filed the informal report, and then when nothing came of it, I told myself I was wrong. You weren't wrong. I know that now. He was quiet for a moment. I also keep thinking that if the malfunction had hit 30 seconds earlier, before I had altitude for the ejection to work, we wouldn't be having this conversation. She didn't fill that silence with anything reassuring. It was true. 30 seconds was nothing and everything. But it didn't, she said. And you had the presence of mind to call in the instrument reading before the malfunction hit, and you held on to what you heard on that channel, even with barotrauma and a partial pressure suit breach and a mountain in between you and the ground. She looked at him steadily. That's not luck. That's training. He nodded slowly. Also, she said, you were an extremely cooperative patient under extremely unpleasant circumstances. That matters more than people think. He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, a short, slightly rough sound that seemed to surprise him by happening, and he pressed a hand briefly to his ribs where the laugh had apparently aggravated something. Ow, don't do that. I'll try to be less accurate, she said. She checked his ear dressing, checked the shoulder bandage, reviewed the monitoring readouts. All of it was where it should be. She noted the updates in his chart and updated the care instructions for the afternoon shift, because it was a habit, and habits were what kept things from getting missed when everything else was on fire. She was at the door when he said, "Can I ask you something?" She turned. "Why did you leave?" He said it carefully, like someone who'd been deciding whether to ask for a while. "The Air Force. Why'd you leave and come here and be a nurse? Not that—" He stopped. "I'm not saying it like that. I mean, you clearly could have done anything." She thought about how to answer that. The real answer was long and had layers she wasn't going to go into in a hospital room with a patient she'd known for less than 12 hours. But there was a version of it that was true enough. "I was tired," she said, "and I wanted to help people without anyone getting shot at, including me." She held the door. "The nursing part, that's not a compromise. That's the job I wanted." He looked at her. "They saluted you in the hallway last night." "I know." "And you just went back to the nursing station." "I had a medication round," she said. She left before he could respond, but through the door she heard him make the sound of someone trying not to laugh again and catching themselves because of the ribs. And she walked down the hallway holding the clipboard with the same steadiness she always held it with, which was the only answer she had to most things. At 11:47 a.m., Greer found her in the East Wing restocking a supply cabinet that needed doing and that she was doing because she needed something physical and simple to occupy her hands while her brain processed the morning. "Murdoch's in custody," he said. She stopped with a box of gauze in her hands. Colorado State Patrol picked him up at the Pueblo bus station. He had $3,000 in cash, a prepaid phone, and a folder. Greer paused. The folder had documentation in it, printed copies of things that should have stayed on the network, contractor authorization records, communications logs, and a set of financial records that appear to detail payments made through the hospital's contractor account to an offshore routing number over 14 months. She set the gauze on the shelf. "He was carrying his own evidence," she said. "He was carrying what he thought was his insurance. Leverage, in case whoever was on the other end of the arrangement tried to cut him loose." Greer's expression had a quality she recognized, the slightly stunned look of someone who has seen a plan collapse in a way that manages to be both elaborate and stupid simultaneously. Instead, he handed it to State Patrol. She thought about that. A man who had spent 8 months constructing a careful arrangement involving military network access and contractor manipulation and the deliberate endangerment of a human life, and who had, when it collapsed, put his contingency in a paper folder and gotten on a bus. Fear did that. It took people who were capable of intricate planning and reduced them to their most basic instincts. Run. Carry the thing that makes you feel safe. Don't think about what happens when you arrive. Where is he now? Federal custody, Denver. He's with a federal public defender, and he hasn't said anything yet. Greer leaned against the supply shelf. But Farrell says the documents in the folder are substantial enough that the conversation about a plea arrangement is probably going to start before the end of the day. And Hale? Still declined to make a statement. His attorney arrived at 10:30. A pause. But Farrell says the financial records Murdoch was carrying show payment disbursements that align with dates in Hale's administrative access log. That's going to be a difficult thing to explain away. She nodded. She put 3 more boxes of gauze on the shelf. Marlowe. His voice had a different quality now. There's one more thing. She waited. The financial records in the folder, the offshore routing payments. Farrell's team ran the account. It traces to a holding structure that took 18 months to unpeel, but they've got it down to the beneficial owner. He took a breath. It's an investment account. Medical technology sector. The account holds shares in 4 private companies that are all bidding on the same contract. A 15-year medical services agreement with the Air Force. A contract that would be worth approximately $400 million over its term. She heard the number and felt the whole structure of it settle into place. Not a personal vendetta. Not a targeted elimination for its own sake. A contract. Money. Ryan Keller had noticed irregularities in a billing system that connected to the financial structure underneath the contract bid. He'd filed a report that had been deleted, and when he'd been assigned to a training rotation that put him in the air over the Rockies, someone had seen an opportunity to close the remaining variable. "Who owns the account?" she said. "A holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The beneficial owner is listed as a trust." He paused. "The trust administrator is Gareth Murdoch's brother-in-law." She leaned against the supply shelf. "So this was never just about the hospital," she said. "No, Horizon Ridge was access. The board liaison role was access. Hale was, we think, recruited specifically because his administrative position at a joint civilian-military facility gave the operation what it needed to reach Peterson's network." Greer said it quietly. "You were incidental. The staffing reclassification, the access monitoring. That was just Hale managing a variable he was aware of. He knew who you were. He knew what you'd been. He just didn't want you moving freely." She thought about 3 years. 3 years of incident reports and medication rounds, and being told to stay in her lane by a man who had looked at her history and decided the most useful thing to do was keep her small. He hadn't been afraid of her specifically. He'd just been careful, the way careful people were careful about anything that didn't fit cleanly into the plan. The irony of it, the specific particular irony, was that if he'd left her alone entirely, if he hadn't flagged her file, hadn't monitored it 6 times over 18 months, hadn't been in that hallway watching when Aldrin saluted her, she might have gone her whole shift last night without anyone understanding what she knew. His own caution had drawn the map that led back to him. She didn't say that out loud. It didn't need saying. "Farrell's going to need another statement from me," she said, "at 2 p.m. He asked if you could make it." "I can make it." She looked at the supply shelf. Everything was stocked. Everything was where it was supposed to be. She closed the cabinet. "Go get some food," Greer said. "You've been up for, what is it now? 31 hours. Marlowe." "I'll eat," she said. "I have to check one thing first." She walked back toward the patient wing, and as she turned the corner toward 214, she nearly collided with a nurse from the day shift named Priya, who pulled up short and looked at her with an expression that Lena couldn't immediately read. Not hostile, not warm, just the slightly arrested quality of someone who was recalibrating. "Marlowe," Priya said. "Priya." A pause. Priya had been one of the nurses who'd looked at her shoes in the trauma bay the night before when Hale had told her to stay in her lane. Lena had noticed. She didn't hold it against her. That kind of thing was structural, not personal. "The board memo came through," Priya said, "about the reclassification." "I know." Another pause. "I saw the salute. Last night. I didn't know what to do with it." Lena looked at her. Priya was 28, good at her job, and had spent 2 years learning how the institutional hierarchy of this building worked before she'd been willing to do anything that diverged from it. That was just survival. Lena understood survival. "You didn't need to do anything with it," Lena said. "You needed to keep doing your job." "Which you did." Priya looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and stepped aside, and Lena continued down the hallway. Room 214 was quiet. Keller was asleep. Finally, genuinely asleep. Not the medication-assisted half-consciousness of the first few hours, but real sleep, the kind the body insisted on after trauma when the adrenaline debt finally came due. His monitoring was clean. His ear dressing was still properly positioned. His shoulder was properly supported by the pillow configuration the morning nurse had arranged. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just long enough to confirm what she needed to confirm. Then she let the door close softly and walked to the nursing station, where she found a chair, sat down, and allowed herself to feel the specific weight of 31 hours pressing down on everything at once. She sat like that for 3 minutes. Then she pulled a fresh chart from the stack and began her notes, because the notes needed doing and she was still there to do them. At 12:20 p.m., her phone rang. Not a text, not a page. A call. Unknown number with a Denver area code. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, clipped, and had the particular tone of someone who was choosing their words carefully because they knew or suspected the call might be recorded. "Ms. Marlowe." A pause. "I think we should talk, before this goes any further." She knew the voice. She'd heard it exactly once, in a hallway 2 years ago, when he'd been introduced to her as part of a board event she'd been asked to attend, and had stayed at for 20 minutes before finding a reason to leave. It wasn't Murdoch. Murdoch was in federal custody. It wasn't Hale. Hale was with his attorney. It was the fourth name. The name nobody had put on a document yet. The person who sat above the holding structure and the trust administrator and the offshore account, far enough removed that Farrell's team had gotten to the beneficial owner and stopped there, because the beneficial owner was the visible layer. The layer above visible was what Lena was listening to right now. "I'm listening," she said. "Good," said the voice. "Because there are things about this situation that your investigators don't have yet. Things I can provide. And I'd rather provide them to you than to a room full of people with recorders." She kept her voice completely even. "Why me?" A pause that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "Because you're the only person in this building," he said, "who I think might actually understand why it got this far." She looked at the wall in front of her. She breathed. "Where are you?" she said. "Close," he said. "I've been close the whole time. That's what I need you to understand." The line stayed open. He didn't hang up. He was waiting for her to decide what to do with what he'd just told her, and she understood with absolute clarity that whatever she did in the next 30 seconds was going to determine how this ended. For Keller, for the investigation, For the $400 million contract that had caused a man to get into an airplane he was never supposed to walk away from. She reached into her pocket and found Farrell's card, and she looked at it, and she looked at the open phone line. And then she made her choice. She looked at Farrell's card. She looked at the open line. She put the card back in her pocket. "Tell me where," she said. A pause. Then, "The chapel annex on the ground floor, east side. It hasn't been used since the renovation. The door's unlocked." She stood up from the chair. She was already thinking about layout. The ground floor east side was accessible from 2 stairwells and had a service corridor that connected to the parking structure. She knew the building. She'd had 3 years to know it. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. She ended the call. Then she immediately called Greer. He picked up on the second ring. "I need you to listen," she said, and her voice was completely level. "And I need you to not ask questions until I'm done." She told him everything in 90 seconds. The call, the voice, the location, the timing. She told him she was going to make the meeting because whoever this was, he was offering information that Farrell's investigation didn't have yet, and if she didn't show up, the window would close and close permanently. Greer's silence lasted 4 seconds. "I'm going to have people in position before you get there," he said. "I know. I'd expect nothing less." "Marlowe, 10 minutes, she said, and hung up. She took the stairwell to the ground floor. The east corridor was a part of the hospital that the renovation had deprioritized. The walls were still the old institutional green, the lighting was fluorescent and intermittent, and the smell was the particular combination of old carpet and cleaning solution that persisted in spaces nobody used regularly. The chapel annex was at the end of the corridor, a room that had been repurposed twice in the hospital's history and was currently nothing in particular. 4 walls, old pews that hadn't been removed, and a set of narrow windows that let in horizontal light from the east. She pushed the door open. He was standing near the windows, 60, maybe 62, well-dressed in the way that spoke of habit rather than occasion. Good coat, good shoes, the kind of grooming that said this was simply how he always looked, not something assembled for the day. He had the specific stillness of someone who had spent decades being the person in the room that other people arranged themselves around. She didn't know his name yet. She was about to. "Ms. Marlowe," he said. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "You know who I am." "I do. I've known for some time." He reached into his coat pocket, slowly, visibly deliberate about the slowness, and produced a business card. He set it on the nearest pew. "My name is Douglas Vane. I sit on the board of 3 medical technology companies, 2 of which are currently in the bidding process for the Air Force contract Farrell's investigation has been examining." She looked at the card but didn't pick it up. "You're the layer above Murdoch," she said. "I'm one of several layers. I won't pretend otherwise." He said it without apparent shame, which was its own kind of information. "What I will tell you is that I did not know about Ryan Keller. I did not authorize, direct, or have prior knowledge of any plan that involved endangering a human life. That's a very specific denial. It's meant to be." She looked at him. He was telling the truth, or he was very good at looking like he was, and in her experience those 2 things required different responses. "Tell me what you did know," she said. He told her. It took 22 minutes. She let him talk without interrupting because interrupting would have given him places to redirect, and she wanted the full shape of it first. "I was precise and organized in the way that people were when they'd been rehearsing a conversation internally for hours, possibly longer. He knew what he was going to say. He'd made his decision before he called her. The structure he described was exactly what Farrell had traced to the beneficial owner layer, and then it went 1 level further. Vane had provided seed capital for the holding structure through 2 intermediaries, both of whom were Murdoch's contacts, not his. He had known about the contractor credential arrangement. He had known about the network access. He had not known that the arrangement had evolved into something that required a pilot to not come home from a training flight. When Keller had noticed the billing irregularities 8 months ago and filed his informal report, Murdoch had deleted it without telling Vane. When Keller had been assigned to the training rotation, the decision to use the maintenance flag and the communication channel, that had been Murdoch and Hale operating on their own calculation about what the risk required. "They didn't tell you," she said. "No. And when you found out? Last night, when Hale called Murdoch and Murdoch called me." He looked at her steadily. I had 12 hours to decide what to do. And you decided to call me instead of a lawyer. I called a lawyer first, he said. Then I called you. She almost respected the honesty of it. What do you want? She said. Cooperation for consideration, formal terms to be negotiated with Farrell's office. He paused. But I wanted to tell you first, personally, because the investigation doesn't have the full financial map yet. I have it. The complete structure, every account, every routing number, every intermediary, names. He paused again. Some of those names are going to be significant. How significant? There are 2 sitting members of a Congressional Defense Subcommittee who hold beneficial interests in one of the companies bidding on the contract. They don't know how the money was being managed below their level, but their interests are documented. She stood very still. Congressional. A $400 million Air Force contract. Congressional committee members with financial stakes they possibly hadn't examined closely enough. This wasn't a hospital story anymore. It probably hadn't been for a long time. You understand what you're handing over, she said. I understand what I'm handing over, yes. His voice was controlled, but underneath it she could hear the specific frequency of a man who has spent decades being powerful and is now standing in an unused chapel annex having a conversation that is going to end his current life in every practical sense. I also understand that if I walk out of this building and try to manage this quietly, the people who will come for me are going to be considerably less interested in the full picture than Farrell is. Murdoch is in custody. He has documents. Whatever deal he makes is going to fold the investigation back toward me regardless of what I do. So this is calculation, she said, not conscience. It's both. He looked at her. I want you to understand that I'm not asking you to feel anything about me. I'm asking you to take the map and use it. She looked at him for a long moment. Stay here, she said. She opened the door and Greer was in the corridor, 6 feet away, with 2 other people in an expression that told her he'd heard most of it through the door or through something she'd inadvertently left open on her phone. She looked at him. Get Farrell. Already called, he said. He's 3 minutes out. She went back inside and stood near the door. Vane hadn't moved from the window. He was looking at the horizontal light coming in and not at her, and she had the impression of a man who had made his decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. Why me? She said. You could have called Farrell directly. He looked back at her. Because I wanted to say this to a person, not a process. And you're the only person in this building who has been directly affected by all of it. The reclassification, the monitoring, the network that ran through your facility, and who hasn't asked for anything. He paused. Everyone else wants something. Immunity, consideration, leverage. You just kept doing your job. She thought about saying something, then she didn't. Farrell came through the door 4 minutes later, and after that the room became procedural, and she stepped back and let it be. What followed was not clean. She wanted to be honest about that, at least to herself, in the hours and days that came after. The way things actually resolved was not the way resolutions looked in the telling of them afterward. Vane gave Farrell the map. It was as complete as he'd said. Account structures, routing numbers, names, dates, the full financial architecture from the congressional beneficial interests down to the contractor payments that had funded the network access scheme. Farrell's team spent 4 days verifying it. They found 3 additional accounts Vane hadn't mentioned, which either meant he'd genuinely forgotten them or was still managing what he disclosed. And the answer to that question was probably both things simultaneously, because people who had spent decades operating in complex financial structures didn't stop being those people when they walked into chapel annexes. Vane's cooperation deal took 11 days to negotiate. It was not a full immunity arrangement. He pled to financial misconduct charges related to the contract bid manipulation, received a substantial fine and a 5-year federal supervised release, and was required to provide full testimony in the proceedings against Murdoch and Hale. His companies were excluded from the Air Force contract bidding process permanently. Murdoch did not get a favorable deal. The documents he'd carried in the folder to Pueblo proved to be exactly the leverage he'd thought they were, except that the leverage worked against him more effectively than it worked for him. The financial records in that folder corroborated Vane's map so precisely that the prosecution's case was built in layers, each one reinforcing the next, and his attorney's attempts to negotiate a plea arrangement ran into the reality that the prosecution didn't need very much from him. He pled guilty to conspiracy charges, wire fraud, and the charge that took the longest to formally construct but that Wilder's JAG team pursued with specific determination willful endangerment of a military service member. His sentencing hearing was set for March. Hale broke on the 9th day. His attorney had spent more than a week arguing that his client's administrative role had been peripheral and that the co-signatory arrangement had been a technical credential rather than an operational authorization, an argument that became substantially more difficult to maintain after Vane's testimony established the exact nature of what the co-signatory role had permitted. Hale gave a formal statement on a Tuesday morning, and the statement confirmed what the financial records had already shown. He had received a total of $214,000 in payments routed through a consulting arrangement that had been constructed specifically to look legitimate. He had known what the network access was being used for. He had not known about the plan for Keller specifically, or he said he hadn't, and that specific claim was the one thing in his statement that remained contested. His surgical license was surrendered as part of the plea agreement. The agreement also required cooperation with the ongoing investigation into the congressional beneficial interests, which was the part of the case that had moved well above Farrell's office and into jurisdictions she only partially understood and didn't need to. She followed the proceedings the way you followed things that had passed through your life and moved on, with attention, but not with the consuming focus of someone still inside it. She had work. She had always had work. 3 weeks after the night of the crash, she was on the East Wing again, which was where she'd been the night it started, and where she would continue to be because that was her assignment and she was good at it. The reclassification had gone through. Senior clinical specialist with the adjusted rate and the retroactive compensation that landed in her account in a single transfer that was larger than any single number she'd seen in a bank statement for 3 years. She'd looked at it for a moment. Then she'd set up an automatic transfer to a medical education fund she'd been contributing to since 2021, increased the contribution amount, and moved on. The East Wing was the same as it always was. Mrs. Yuen had been discharged 2 days after the crash and had sent a card, an actual paper card, with a stamp, that was sitting on the nursing station desk because nobody had figured out what to do with it, and Lena hadn't taken it home yet, and it had somehow become a fixture. Priya worked the overlapping shift hours with a slightly different quality to her attention now, the kind of difference that wasn't dramatic but was real. She asked questions more readily. She pushed back on things that needed pushing on. Whether that was connected to what had happened or was her own independent development, Lena genuinely didn't know and didn't claim credit either way. What she noticed was that people spoke to her differently, not deferentially. She didn't want that, and it would have made the work harder. But without the specific quality of performance that had always been there before, the half-second assessment that preceded any interaction where someone had already decided how much weight to give her answer, that was gone. It had happened gradually, over days, and it was still happening. She wasn't sure how she felt about it. Mostly she tried not to think about it too much because the thinking about it was more exhausting than the having gone through it. Aldrin called her on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after the crash. She was in the break room eating a sandwich she'd bought from the second-floor vending machine, which was not a great sandwich, but was a sandwich. "I have an offer to relay," he said, "from AFSOC, formally." She kept eating. "Relay it." "They want to establish a joint civilian-military trauma consultation role. New position. It would be based here at Horizon Ridge, given the facility's relationship with Peterson. The person in the role would serve as the primary liaison for high-altitude and ejection injury protocol development and would have a secondary advisory function for medical readiness assessments across joint facilities in the region." He paused. "They wrote the position description with you in mind. I won't pretend they didn't." "What's the reporting structure?" "Dual reporting. Horizon Ridge Clinical Leadership and Peterson's Medical Readiness Command. You'd maintain your nursing responsibilities here. The advisory function is additive, not a replacement." She finished the sandwich. She thought about it. "It would mean putting my name on things," she said. "Yes." "Advisory reports, protocol documents. Things with my name on them." "Yes." She thought about 3 years of being careful to stay small. About the calculation she'd made when she'd first walked into this building. That small and steady was the sustainable shape for what she wanted to do with the years she had left in medicine. About whether that calculation had been wisdom or just the most sophisticated way she'd found to keep herself from having to want things that required exposure to get. "Tell me the salary range," she said. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. "That's more than I'm making now." Yes, by a significant margin. They were very motivated to write a competitive offer. She set the sandwich wrapper on the table. Outside the break room window, the Rockies were doing what they always did in early morning light, catching it at an angle that made them look improbable, the kind of visual that still got her after 3 years, which she'd never admitted to anyone because it seemed like the kind of thing a person should eventually stop noticing. She hadn't stopped. "I'll think about it," she said. "Lena, I said I'll think about it, Marcus. That's not a no." A pause. She could hear in his breathing the specific frustration of a man who was used to a faster pace than she provided, and had been for years, and had never fully made his peace with it. "Take your time," he said, in a tone that meant the opposite. "I always do," she said. She hung up and sat in the break room for another 4 minutes, looking at the mountains. Ryan Keller was discharged on a Friday. He walked out of room 214 under his own power, which his doctor had cleared that morning, which had taken 11 days from the night he'd come in on a gurney from the rooftop. His right ear was still sensitive. His shoulder was in a partial brace that would come off in another 3 weeks. He looked, Lena thought when she saw him in the hallway, like a man who had been taken apart and put back together with most of the same pieces, arranged in slightly different order. He was in his uniform. Someone had brought it from Peterson. She didn't know who, but it was pressed and correct, and he wore it with the particular straightness that was specific to military bearing, the posture of someone who had been trained to mean something with how they stood. He found her at the nursing station before he left. She'd been expecting that. "I wanted to say something and I couldn't figure out what," he said. "So I'm going to just say the obvious thing." "All right." "You saved my life." She looked up from the chart she'd been marking. "The rescue team got you off the mountain." "You got me off the mountain," he said. "The rescue team carried me. That's different, and you know it's different." She put the pen down. She looked at him. He was 31, and he had the slightly unsteady quality of someone who had recently been reminded of everything that could be lost, and who was carrying that awareness with him the way you carried new weight, carefully, not entirely sure of the balance yet. She recognized that too. She'd been there. "You're going to be all right," she said. "The ear will clear, the shoulder will heal, and the investigation—" "I know about the investigation," he said. "Wilder keeps me informed." A pause. "I know what Vane told Farrell. I know about the congressional piece." He exhaled. "It's bigger than I thought when I noticed those numbers 8 months ago. Most things are bigger than they look from the outside. I should have pushed harder. When the report disappeared, I should have— Ryan." She said his name the same way she'd said it the first night, when he'd been asking about the aircraft from a hospital gurney. He stopped. "You filed the report. The report was deleted by people who had constructed a system specifically to delete things like it. You weren't supposed to be able to push harder. That was the point of the system." She looked at him steadily. "You survived. You held on to what you heard on that channel, even with barotrauma at 11,000 feet. You gave us the second voice. That's the chain of events that broke the system open, and it started with you noticing something in a briefing room 8 months ago that you were never supposed to notice." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been told," he said carefully, "that there's a new liaison position being established here, consultation role. Word travels fast. Peterson is a small installation." She picked up the pen. "I haven't decided. What would it take?" She thought about that. About what it would mean to put her name on things again. Not the way she'd had her name on things before, in a life that had consumed her in ways that were glorious and damaging in roughly equal proportion, but in a different configuration. A sustainable one. One that still let her have the medication rounds and the supply cabinet restocking and Mrs. Ewan's cards. "I'm still thinking," she said. He nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the desk beside her pen. She looked at it. A challenge coin, Air Force, old design, not current issue. The kind that was passed between people as a specific kind of acknowledgement rather than a formal commendation. "That's my grandfather's," he said. He flew Korea. He said the only rule for a challenge coin is that it goes to the person who changed your direction when you needed changing. She looked at the coin. She didn't pick it up. "I'll hold it here," she said, "at the station." He understood what that meant. She wasn't declining it. She was putting it somewhere that belonged to the work rather than to herself, which was different. "Okay," he said. He held out his hand. She shook it, which was also different from a salute. And better, she thought. More accurate. He walked out through the double doors at the end of the hallway. She watched him go. Then she looked at the coin on the desk for a moment, and she set it in the small drawer under the station counter where she kept the things that mattered and that she didn't need to look at constantly to remember. She told Aldrin yes on the following Monday. She called him at 7 a.m. before her shift, standing in the parking lot in a coat that wasn't quite warm enough for the October temperature, looking at the mountains which were doing the thing again with the light. Yes, she said when he answered. I'll take the role. A silence that was different from his frustrated silences. Shorter, lighter. I'll let them know, he said. Tell them the nursing responsibilities aren't negotiable. Full caseload, East Wing. I'll tell them. And the position title needs to not be ceremonial. If I'm in the room for protocol development, I need to be in the room with authority to change protocols. Understood. And Marcus, yes. I want the staffing assessment process at joint facilities reviewed as part of the first advisory cycle. The mechanism that Murdoch and Hale used to classify personnel without proper oversight. That has to be closed. Not just for me, for whoever comes after. A pause. She could hear him writing. I'll make sure that's in the mandate, he said. Good. She looked at the mountains. That's all. Lena. His voice had something in it she didn't hear often. Not sentimentality. He wasn't built for that. But something adjacent to it. The specific warmth of someone who has been worried about a person for a long time and can now, finally, stop. I'm glad you picked up the phone. You mean when Greer paged me during the emergency? I mean 3 years ago, when you left and took the nursing job. I'm glad you stayed in medicine. She didn't know what to say to that. The honest answer was that she hadn't known, when she'd taken the job, whether it was medicine she was staying in or just a version of hiding that looked productive. She still wasn't sure, 3 years and one very specific night later, how much of each it had been. Probably both. Probably she'd needed both to get to the place where she could pick up a challenge coin from a pilot in a hallway and feel like something was starting rather than ending. Go call them, she said. I'm calling, he said. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood in the parking lot for another minute. The cold was real now. A genuine October cold that had teeth, the kind that said the mountains were already thinking about snow even if the city wasn't ready for it. Then she went inside because she had a shift, and the medication round started in 20 minutes, and Mr. Pellegrino in 108 had a post-surgical follow-up she wanted to check before the day attending arrived. And the supply cabinet in the East Corridor needed the gauze that she'd restocked 2 days ago, already checked again because somehow gauze always went faster than the inventory projected. She badged through the door. The lobby was doing what lobbies did in the early morning, a specific kind of populated quiet. The people who arrived before 8 moving with the particular purpose of those who'd already shifted into their day. She walked through it the way she always walked through it, without hurrying, without performing, with the particular economy of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. At the East Wing nursing station, Priya was finishing the overnight handoff notes. She looked up when Lena came in. Pellegrino had a rough night, she said. Low-grade fever at 4, resolved by 6. I updated the chart. Thank you. Lena set her bag under the desk. What else? New admit in 110. 47-year-old male, hypertensive crisis, came in at 2 a.m., stabilized. He's anxious and he keeps asking when someone's going to actually talk to him. I'll start with him. She picked up the chart for room 110 and moved toward the hallway, and the East Wing came up around her the way it always did. The particular smell of it, the particular light, the baseline hum of machines doing their quiet, continuous work of monitoring the distance between fine and not fine. She pushed the door to 110 open. The man inside was 47, heavy-set, sitting up in the bed with the wired quality of someone whose body had scared him and who hadn't had time yet to understand what had happened. He looked at her the way patients looked at you when they'd been waiting, with a kind of hungry attention, the specific need to be seen by a person rather than just processed by a system. I'm Lena Marlowe, she said, pulling the chair close. I'm your nurse this morning. I've looked at your chart. Tell me what you're feeling right now. He exhaled. He started talking. She listened. That was the thing that people who hadn't done this work didn't understand. The listening was not the waiting for the information that let you do the real job. The listening was the real job. It always had been. A person in a hospital bed was a person in the most distilled version of their own vulnerability. And what they needed, underneath the monitoring and the medication and the clinical protocol, was someone who understood that being that vulnerable was something that happened to people and not something that defined them. She had spent a decade learning how to save lives in conditions that made a hospital seem like an impossible luxury. She had spent 3 years learning how to save lives in a hallway where she wasn't allowed to speak. She was about to spend whatever came next doing both at once, in a role with her name on it, in a building that now knew exactly who she was. She was not a legend. She was a person who was good at her job and who had spent a long time letting other people decide how visible that was allowed to be. She had let them decide because it had felt, for a long time, like the cost of staying in a place where she could still do good work. She understood now that the cost had been hers to set, not theirs. The man in room 110 was telling her about the moment he'd felt the pressure change in his chest, the specific quality of that fear, the way he'd sat with it for an hour before calling anyone because he hadn't wanted to be the kind of person who made a fuss. She recognized that too. She recognized it in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. She asked him the next question, and then the next, and the morning moved forward the way mornings did, imperfect, unremarkable, necessary, and hers. Outside the window of room 110, Denver was fully awake. The Rockies were doing the thing with the light. The challenge coin was in the drawer at the East Wing nursing station, and the reclassification document was in the administrative file, and somewhere in the building. Farrell's investigation had left marks on the walls that would take a long time to fully account for. And Lena Marlowe, senior clinical specialist, liaison consultant, former Air Force combat medic, the woman they had spent 3 years calling just a nurse, was exactly where she had chosen to be, doing what she had always done. Because the work didn't ask you what your rank was. It asked you what you had, and she had always had enough.